What's going on, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, we're going to talk about something that's long been discussed, but I believe it's not been discussed accurately, and that is who is the real threat in America. Now, our celebrity in chief, Donald Trump, would have you believe it's extreme Islamists or the mob of Democrats. That was a main part of his campaign run, the fear mongering technique that he used to try to stoke fear amongst his base, to rile them up and make them believe that it was illegal immigrants and people from Islamic nations or black people were the true threat in America. But I'm not having it. So the real threat in America has been and always will be white people. To be more specific, extreme right-winged white people. So let's take a look at some examples of white people in America partaking in senseless and unprovoked violence, and specifically against black people. Now, Black Wall Street is something that I've slightly spoken about and will soon do a video entirely on it. But for the purposes of right now, let me just give you the Cliff Notes version. So Black Wall Street was an area of small black-owned businesses and residents in the neighborhood of Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. It was the first area like this in America. It was thriving and expanding rapidly until white residents got jealous of their black counterparts and they began destroying, burning down, and looting the businesses and residents in the area. And the U.S. military even got involved and bombed the area. And it's estimated that 35 or 34 people died and more than 35 blocks of the neighborhood were destroyed. Now, from 1921, we come up to 1949, where in St. Louis, they desegregated a public pool. And on the first day of it being open and desegregated, 30 black residents showed up for a swim, and within hours, upwards of 5,000 white residents in the area came to the pool and began mobbing the black people with knives, bats, bricks, and pipes. In 1953, at Trumbull Park in Chicago, white residents attempted to intimidate the housing authority for putting projects in mixed-race neighborhoods. In 1966, a mob of white people attacked a peaceful protest led by Martin Luther King Jr. in Marquette Park in Chicago. In 1971, white residents of Pontiac, Michigan used dynamite to blow up 13 school buses to prevent desegregation of the schools in the area. In 1974, white students held black students hostage in South Boston High School and broke windows and doors of the federal building because a federal court had just ordered schools to be desegregated in the area. It's not just regular white American citizens that qualify as the greatest threat in America. Law enforcement officials have long been a danger to black people in this country, but that's nothing new. Now, it was in 1969 that the state attorney of Chicago, Edward Harahan, organized a police raid on the home of 21-year-old Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton. The FBI had already been infiltrating and wiretapping the phones of the organization, as they were just doing a year prior to Dr. King before he was assassinated. So on December 4th of 1969, Chicago police shot through the door of the apartment, killing a 17-year-old member of the party, and then carried on to fire dozens of rounds into the apartment, many of them striking Fred Hampton. He then crawled out of bed into the hallway of the apartment and was shot 2 more times in the head. This shooting was deemed as justifiable use of force, even though experts who examined the crime scene found that the only bullet that came from inside the apartment to the outside of the apartment was an accidental firing of the firearm held by the 17-year-old who was shot in the chest through the door by Chicago police. So here we have another clear-cut case of planned, unprovoked targeting of black and brown bodies by white law enforcement officials, which is not too much different from what we have today in America. One last note on the assassination of Fred Hampton. At the time, President Hoover had even made a statement that his goal was to disrupt, expose, discredit any black nationalist group and prevent the rise of a, quote, black messiah that can electrify and unify black people. Now, if we look at present day, we all know the story way too well of mass shootings and active shooter situations, but I'm just going to rattle off a couple of the more recent ones that I'm sure a lot of you will remember. In Aurora, Colorado, there was a movie theater shooting, and during the screening of The Dark Knight Rises. In Newtown, Connecticut, we had the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. In Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Roof shot up an all-black church, and a federal judge did not deem this as an act of terrorism, although Dylan Roof had ties to white supremacist groups, and he said, quote, he was there to shoot black people. Las Vegas, Nevada, Stephen Paddock shot 58 people at a country music festival. In Charlottesville, Virginia, a white supremacist ran down Heather Heyer in a counter protest to a neo-Nazi protest and killed her. In South Carolina, in the latter months of 2018, a white man killed 2 black police officers. And in Louisville, Kentucky, an alleged white supremacist killed 2 black people in a Kroger grocery store in cold blood. And I've touched on this before. When he left the grocery store, another white citizen pulled out his firearm, and just in confusion as to what was going on. And when the shooter passed this other white civilian, he said, "Whites don't shoot whites." In Texas, in the end of December of 2018, a white man shot into the car of a black family in a Walmart parking lot, and he killed a 7-year-old in the car. In Oakland, California last year, there was an alleged white supremacist who stabbed 2 black girls in the neck at a train station, and one of them was fatally wounded. In Florida, we all remembered last fall the right-wing extremists who sent bombs to notable Democratic leaders and opposers of Trump, now deemed the MAGA bomber. And in Pittsburgh, PA, we had the extreme right-wing white man who shot up a Jewish synagogue and was known to make anti-Semitic remarks on social media. And after nearly all of these instances of extreme right-wingers or white people taking the lives of innocent people, some by the dozens, the news and media outlets will still write it off as mental illness. But if a black teen in Chicago shot another black teen, or this happened in Memphis, it wouldn't be covered nationally, nor would it be linked to possible mental illness. But can it not be quantified that a black teen could be suffering from PTSD when he grew up in a rough area like Memphis or Chicago or St. Louis, and he's suffering from PTSD, a mental illness, from seeing many members of his family killed or many of his friends being killed? So it seems to me that mental illness is only a luxury of white people. Now, to further make the point that I made in the beginning of the video, that it is the goal of Donald Trump and his administration and white supremacists to make people believe that extreme Islamists or illegal immigrants from Mexico or anybody from a Muslim country is the real threat in America, I found one interesting fact. In 2017, the Trump administration stopped funding an organization called Life After Hate. It's a group that is centered on de-radicalizing and reforming former members of these hate groups after they've left. And this would only be done for one reason. Trump and his administration do not want to pour funds into stopping white domestic terrorism because they want to believe that it doesn't actually exist. But keep in mind, the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled off was convincing everyone that he didn't exist. Now, I want to talk numbers. I've given you plenty of history and examples of violence carried out by white people and domestic terrorism on their part, but now let's get into some data. According to, bear with me, the Nation Institute's Investigative Fund and Center of Investigative Reporting's reveal, from 2018 to 2016, there were twice as many terror attacks by right-wing extremists compared to Islamic extremists. Additionally, there was found to be a significant disproportionality in how the United States combats and funds the stop of domestic terrorism. This ties back into my point about the Trump administration seizing the funding of the de-radicalization group Life After Hate. Also, from 2008 to 2016, there were 63 cases of Islamic domestic terrorism, and 76% of them were prevented. In the same time span, there was 115 extreme right-wing attacks that took place, but just 35% of those were thwarted. It's a huge disparity in the effort by United States law enforcement to combat homegrown right-wing terrorism. According to CNN, from 1966 to 2012, the U.S. was responsible for 31% of the public mass shootings in the entire world, even though we only make up 5% of the world's population. And the next closest nation to us was the Philippines at just 18%. So we nearly double the Philippines in terms of mass shootings. Statistica.com tells us that from 1982 up until November 2018, 60 white people committed a mass shooting in the country, compared to black people where it was just 17. So white people are 3.5 more times likely to commit a mass shooting than black people. And lastly, according to Newsweek, since 1982, 54% of the mass shootings in the United States were done by white males. So there you have it. I've laid it out pretty thoroughly and plainly in my opinion, and it's pretty black and white, no pun intended. And I, of course, do not believe that all white people are violent or all white people will commit acts of domestic terrorism. But I do know that more often than not, it is a white person, and a white male specifically, carrying out these acts of domestic terrorism and random acts of violence against groups of people. And the only reason that I could find that it is them that more often not commit these mass shootings is a quote from a criminologist by the name of James Allen Fox, and he told the Washington Post in 2012, "They often complain that their job was taken by blacks, Mexicans, or Jews. They feel that a well-paid job is their birthright, and it's a blow to their psyche when they lose that. If you're a member of a group that hasn't historically experienced unemployment, there's a far greater stigma to losing that job than those who have." And the reason I bring this up and the reason I agree with it is because if you look at some of these white men who have committed these acts, like the man who shot up the movie theater in Colorado, he was just kicked out of his PhD course. Dylan Roof, who shot up the church in Charleston, South Carolina, he had been unemployed for months before he committed that act of violence. So there kind of is a tie-in and a correlation between unemployed white men and a mass shooting. I'm sure some of you watching may throw out the argument of, well, what about black on black crime? Well, we can get into that too. I found through my research, again, I urge you to do your own and bring it to me if you found something opposing what I say, but through my research, I found that black people who are murdered, 89% of the time, it's by another black person. And white people who are murdered, 81% of the time, it is by another white person. So that just shows that there isn't this huge disparity or disproportionality when it comes to black people killing other black people and white people killing other white people. So that's exactly what makes the black on black crime argument meritless. So I've said what I said, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks for watching.